Hi, Steve. I'm here with Steve Ujifusa. And Steve is the author of a wonderful book called A Man and His Ship, America's Greatest Naval Architect and His Quest to Build the SS United States. It was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the top 10 nonfiction books of 2012. It's a personal favorite of mine. In doing some research on a book that I was writing, I came across this and actually ended up using some of the stories and the personality of the William Francis Gibbs, the architect of this great ship, as an example of some things that I wanted to talk about. So, Steve, welcome to Knowledge of Wharton.
No, thank you so much for having me.
So I just thought it would be interesting if we could chat a little bit about both your journey in writing this book and also the journey you chronicle, William Francis Gibbs, and his remarkable achievement in building the SS United States. So why don't we just start by giving you a chance to tell our audience, how did you stumble into this topic? What was it that prompted you to write about this remarkable man?
Well, for me, I was always interested in ocean liners for as far back as I can remember, and ships in the sea in general. My grandmother was a passenger on the SS United States, and she told me stories of what it was like on board, and she also told me the story of the Titanic, which first got me interested in ships in the sea when I was around 6 or 7 years old. And it was a personal passion of mine. I was a little kid that built models of ships in my parents' basement. And I first saw the SS United States when we were looking at colleges my junior year, and we were driving over the Wharton Bridge in 1996. And the SS United States, once the glory of the American passenger fleet, had just arrived in Philadelphia and was sitting there rusted and abandoned. And I pointed at it and said, "Oh, there it is, there it is." And my grandmother was in the car with us, and she said, "Oh, I remember that ship." And I ended up coming to Philadelphia for graduate school and never leaving, been here ever since. And back in 2007, I started doing some freelance pieces, and one of them was on the SS United States because I had just been fascinated with it. And the editor at Plan Philly, a gentleman called Matt Golis, said, "Well, we've always wanted to have someone write about that. How about you tell us more about the man who designed it?" And then it ended up evolving into a book proposal, and it was published by Simon & Schuster after about 5 years of work. And for me, it started off with the interest in the ship as an American icon, as a true masterpiece of American technology built at a time in the 1940s and 50s when America was at the top of its manufacturing prowess. And as one maritime historian said, this is a ship that was like a cathedral. It was built to last forever in terms of how well she was built. But then I began thinking about, what about the man who created the ship? That's what ultimately made the book, is what sort of creative person did it take to design a ship this spectacular and this strong and fast? Why did he want to build the finest, fastest ocean liner in the world? And then I began looking at William Francis Gibbs and discovered this man is on par with Frank Lloyd Wright, John Augustus Roebling, who designed the Brooklyn Bridge, one of these American creative individuals who uses the American industrial system, the financial system, and his own creativity and vision to create not just a ship that was built to transport people from A to B, but something to transcend that, to be a floating work of art. This man was so in love with this ship that he would greet it every time the ship came into New York. And someone once asked him, "Mr. Gibbs, do you love that ship more than your wife?" And he responded, "You're 1,000% correct." What sort of person is this?
Someone who's married to his work, I guess.
Very much so.
So tell us a little bit about the story that William Francis Gibbs, that you uncovered about him. What led him to become interested in ships?
Well, in 1894, when he was an 8-year-old boy, he was brought by his father to the cramped shipyards on the banks of the Delaware here in Philadelphia. And he saw an ocean liner launch called the St. Louis, and she roared down the ways, sending up clouds of smoke as she splashed into the Delaware. The crowds were cheering, the American flags were waving. And Gibbs said, "From that moment, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I knew I wanted to be a naval architect." His father was an extremely wealthy financier. He was very closely connected with the Widener family. He was one of the richest men in Philadelphia. And his father said, that is not a good career to be a naval architect. And Gibbs ended up going to Harvard in preparation to be a lawyer. He proved to be a terrible engineering student and a math student. And he ultimately, and this is the defining event of his life, he was brought up in a big mansion in Rittenhouse Square, all the comforts and conveniences of the early 1900s Gilded Age America. But then his senior year, his father went bankrupt, and the family lost everything.
This was about, what,
1910.
1910, okay.
1910. And Gibbs would later say, if not for the fact that my father had gone bankrupt, I never would have amounted to anything in life. And that, I think, really gave him the drive to reinvent himself from being the poor little rich boy who loved ships into being someone who's saying, you know what, I'm going to be a naval architect and I'm going to do it on my terms. My father pursued this path, and he basically tried to make me do something I didn't want to do, and I'm going to show him I can do what I want to do.
So Gibbs really was a man who saw the dream very early in life when he had this experience with the ship launching, and then found the motivation sort of a little bit later while he was in college, and then spent the rest of his life essentially pursuing the dream.
Very much so. And he and his brother Frederick became very close business partners. And they came up with designs in 1914 for a 1,000-foot-long American ocean liner. And this is a time when America was not really building passenger ships. And Gibbs, who actually ended up finishing his training as a lawyer at Columbia, he ended up working his way through law school at his father's insistence, said, I can't be stuck in this profession I can't stand. I need to do something I really love to do. So he ultimately finagled two connections. One was to a gentleman called Admiral David W. Taylor, who was chief constructor of the U.S. Navy, who also was very interested in America building up its passenger and naval fleets at the time. Taylor ended up meeting this young, very nerdy, very socially awkward young man from Philadelphia and said, this kid has some issues with math, but he has drive, he has talent. And Taylor ends up taking Gibbs under his wing and providing a lot of the training that Gibbs never had and a lot of the support and credentials. But then Gibbs also got introduced to J.P. Morgan Jr., who was the son of the famous banker. And J.P. Morgan Jr. had his own issues with shipping because his father was one of the principal, actually he was the principal investor in the White Star Line that built the RMS Titanic.
Ah, so all shipping stories either begin and or go through the Titanic.
Oddly enough, William Francis Gibbs, when he was designing the ship that became the SS United States, his primary focus was, I want this ship to be able to withstand the same damage that sank the Titanic in 1912. And that was sort of the departure point for ship safety. And he felt that a lot of shipping companies were skimping on safety for the sake of passenger comfort, for the sake of cost saving. And he would later say that it is almost a crime for a company to skimp on safety for the sake of short-term cost saving, because the potential damage that could happen to a company when hundreds, or in the case of the Titanic, 1,500 people killed, is definitely, it actually makes better business sense to over-engineer a ship for safety.
We're having a little example of air safety even as we do this interview with the Boeing Dreamliner, the latest technology of the air, having not been completely flawlessly designed, and now the fleet's on the sidelines for a few weeks or months as they figure out the battery problem that it's having. So let me ask you a little bit. I know that William Francis Gibbs was on the cover of Time magazine one year in the 40s. What brought him to the cover of Time magazine?
Well, Gibbs by the 1940s had founded his own very successful naval architecture firm. David W. Taylor, the famous admiral, had become a partner. His brother was a partner. And they ended up becoming the leading Navy contractors, building new Navy ships during the 1930s, during the build-up to World War II. And Gibbs's real strength, I mean, as one of his colleagues said, he was a great designer, but his real strength lay in project management. He was very much kind of a Steve Jobs figure who came up with the concept of how he wanted a ship to look, the specifications it was to have, and then would work very closely with very talented subordinates who were very good technically to come out with the finished product. He was an utter control freak, and he also had a very notorious mouth. He spoke with the diction of a Philadelphia aristocrat, but had the mouth of a sailor. And he ended up getting on the cover of Time magazine because his firm was responsible for the production of the famous Liberty ships, which were the first true mass-produced cargo ships in which America's industrial engine was thrown behind the war effort. And this is a time when America could produce, at one time, a Liberty ship in 3 weeks from start to finish, prefabbing a lot of stuff off-site and then building these ships basically faster than the Germans could sink them. And that's what landed him on the cover of Time magazine. He was called the technological revolutionist. He brought Henry Ford's idea of mass production from cars to ships.
Interesting. And I seem to remember somewhere in your book that actually he, not just a Liberty ship, but his firm ended up designing something like 3/4 of all the ships that the Americans used in the war effort, or some large percentage?
Yes, his firm, Gibbs & Cox, was responsible directly or indirectly for 70% of all ships built during World War II, all Navy ships. And his firm ended up becoming one of the leading military contractors. He loved passenger ship design, but he saw it didn't really pay that much. So he decided to focus on government contracts. He had a relationship with President Roosevelt, who loved ships himself, and that really grew his business. He ended up employing nearly 2,000 draftsmen, designers, engineers in his firm in Lower Manhattan by the end of World War II.
Interesting. Let's segue just a little bit. You mentioned Steve Jobs as a modern person with some of the same qualities that William Francis Gibbs had. Tell me a little bit about Steve Jobs' personality is now, part of the public discourse because of a biography recently written by Walter Isaacson. You've gotten William Francis Gibbs into our imagination. What kind of person was he, and why do you compare him as a personality to Steve Jobs?
Well, in many ways, Gibbs was an engineer with the soul of an artist. And I think Gibbs was someone who had very little patience for small talk. When he was talking, he was very to the point of what he wanted. As a young man, when he was just starting out, as a designer, he felt he was too nice and too meek, and he felt that his ideas were getting bowled over. So in his early 30s, he sort of had this transformation where he said, you know what, if I want to get something done, if I want to aim for an ambitious goal, being disagreeable or even being nasty is a way of getting to a greater goal. He would later tell his staff, when they finished designing the SS United States, I apologize for how I behaved, but this is like trying to build a pyramid here. And Gibbs was the sort of guy that would sneak up on his designers when they were working soundlessly. It kind of creeped them out a little bit. But he was everywhere. He kept tabs on everything everyone was doing.
Sort of a control personality, but he knew exactly what he wanted at the end.
Exactly. He was a very controlling personality. He also had a great sense of humor. Loved giving speeches, and Steve Jobs was a similar way. Very charismatic persuader for impossible ideas. And Gibbs once said, "If I didn't have a sense of humor working with shipbuilders, I would have been dead a long time ago." And he says, everyone thinks I'm such a mean fellow because I like ships more than people.
Interesting.
Which is, I think it was a dig at himself, but also revealing that he was devoted to creation.
Did he have the same problems with his family life as Jobs seems to have had with his?
He had a very distant relationship with his children. He and his wife ended up leading relatively separate lives by when they were older. Vera was the daughter of Paul Cravath, the famous New York attorney who founded Cravath, Swaine & Moore. Mm-hmm. And she was very devoted to her husband and his creation. But Gibbs, on one hand, I think relied on her, but then he once said in a New Yorker interview, my wife is a beautiful, intelligent, wonderful woman. She goes her way and I go mine. Perhaps that's why we get along so well. So it was kind of a telling thing. I think he wanted to create his own world. Right. And Gibbs & Cox, his firm, was a very closely guarded, basically under the context of military secrecy.
Sure.
There were all mazes of barriers to get in and get out. He once told a security guard, please check the identification of everyone who comes in here. And the next day, William Francis Gibbs walks in the door, and this is a story from one naval architect told me. And the security guard sees the Gibbs in and waves him through. And Gibbs says, "You're fired. You should have asked me."
For his ID.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think like Jobs and Gibbs, they want to create their own sort of little creative worlds.
And I guess in the high-tech sense, trade secrets and all that stuff creates the need for that kind of careful scrutiny and security. And in Gibbs's world, it was the government contracts and the secrets of naval design and then his own personality that did it.
Oh, they all meshed very well. I mean, the naval vessels he were designing were top secret.
Right.
And there were a lot of other naval firms that wanted to get a look at what he was doing. There was one exception, though. He asked a bishop to come in and take a look at what he was doing.
A bishop.
And the bishop said, "Are you sure you want me to come into this model shop and see all the stuff you're doing? You know how clergy talk." And Gibbs said, "That's okay. I'm not worried about you. I'm not only convinced in your character, but in the abysmal ignorance of the things you're about to see."
Well, Steve, I remember when I first moved to Philadelphia, going down to the docks here in Philadelphia and seeing this great, huge, hulking vessel parked on the Delaware River and wondering what on earth could that be? And it said SS United States on the side. And having read your book, a whole area of not just Philadelphia history, but also the history of American business and this incredibly important shipbuilding industry that the United States was so strong in over the years, really came to life. So thank you for bringing that all to us.
Thank you.